needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion. America needs to be taken down to God's bathhouse and the hose turned on her. And the time isn't far distant when the wheels of God's judgment are going to go sweeping through this old God-hating world. And I want to take a pledge in this audience to join me in a pledge that you will never rest until this old God-hating, Christ-hating, whiskey-soaked, Sabbath-breaking, blaspheming, infidel, bootlegging old world is bound to the cross of Jesus Christ by the golden chains of love.
Well, hello there. Welcome to HDC. Thrilled that you're here today. Also excited that we've got folks in all sorts of places, Apple Valley and Phelan. Hello, hello. That's Billy Sunday, if you don't know. It sounds a little bit like the Wizard of Oz when he was still living in Kansas, I know. But that's Billy Sunday, famous/infamous preacher in America in the 20s, I believe. Just thought you should know. I did a report on him once upon a time in college. Hey, you came in. You were worried that suddenly the desert had turned into the south because now we have heat and humidity. And in your moment of panic, you forgot to grab notes. We'd love to give them to you. So raise your hand. We'll bring notes to you or your Bible. We'll be in the book of Jeremiah in the 7th chapter. So if you've got a paper Bible and an electronic one, you can open those up to the 7th chapter of Jeremiah. We're in our 3rd week of a series called Turn or Burn, and it is the maybe the prototypical view of what Christianity is, at least to the world around us, that we're a bunch of street preachers with sandwich signs pointing fingers at everyone, telling them the end is near. And ironically, that is very much the theme and the feel as you read through both the major and the minor prophets. It was a bunch of fellows on street corners calling out to the people around them to turn or be worried for what God had in store. But we want to look at it and say, okay, what was God really doing in the lives of His people? What was happening with them, and what were God's intentions and plans? And so we're going to look at a number of the prophets. I'm going to shoot myself in the foot right now because it's really rare that I get to be with us back to back. I kind of bounce all over here, 7, youth. But I'm going to be with us this weekend and next, both in the book of Jeremiah. This week, chapter 7, and then the next weekend, I believe, is chapter 31. And I love the fact that I get to do that because Jeremiah is an important book to tie together the Old and the New Testament. But I'm going to say if the heat has pulled you off track in your Route 66 or school shopping or, I don't know, the Olympics, any number of things have pulled you off track and suddenly somehow it's turned into a race and you feel like because you've fallen behind that you're not going to catch back up, whoa, kill that noise. Hop into the book of Ezekiel in the next couple of weeks because we're going to be in it in church in a couple of weekends, and the book of Ezekiel is striking. Very vivid word pictures, very vivid things that God had Ezekiel do. It's just a fascinating book. I don't expect you to get everything in it, but I do expect you to be like, what is happening here? Because we'll spend a couple of weekends teaching through it, and it would be a great way to do 2 things. 1, to get you back into our reading, and number 2, Ezekiel has got a lot of these crazy tones that God is screaming into the lives of His kids through the prophets. And so it'll really catch what's happening in a lot of the prophets, but it's also another great way to catch your attention and pull you back in. I'll take us through chapter 7 of Jeremiah today, but before we do, I want to give you 4 maybe just overview kind of facts so that you feel calibrated to where and what's going on and when we read this book. The books of the prophets bounce between different genres of literature. They use sometimes metaphors to describe the people of God. Sometimes the prophets will speak about the nations who are around the people of God. Sometimes the metaphors will describe a specific person. Sometimes it's the whole nation. So sometimes it's difficult to track with the different sections of a book if you're unfamiliar with it. And so I'm going to try and familiarize you a little bit with the whole book of Jeremiah so that it's more comfortable for you to read. First thing you need to know is that Jeremiah was part of the southern kingdom, okay? We're about 600 years before Christ at this point. The northern kingdom has been carried off by the Assyrians, okay? And it's easy for the nation of Judah. You would think that that would get their attention. But they do what probably most of us do. We justify our own spot in life, and we say, well, God must love us and not them because he carried them away and he left us. And so rather than taking it as this huge warning call, they justified who they were, and Jeremiah is part of this southern kingdom. He comes to popularity around the same time Josiah became king, but when he really starts to lead is around the same time that Jeremiah begins to preach. And so you've got this incredible reformer in Josiah and this reforming preacher in Jeremiah living side by side. There's not a ton in Scripture where their lives overlap, but their ministry does. Very similar time frames. But Jeremiah, in a minute, I'll tell you, he goes past Josiah. Throw up the next little fact for us. He's a contemporary with 6 other prophets that are in our Old Testament. There may have been other men of God, maybe women of God, who were speaking into the life of the culture. But Jeremiah is a contemporary living side by side with 6 other prophets. And even though God, I don't know if you've ever been so frustrated with your kids probably never frustrated you this much. But if you ever have a loved one or a kid, a parent, a spouse that you're so frustrated with them that you tell them, I can't even talk to you right now. At a couple of points in the book of Jeremiah, God tells him, listen, I'm going to tell you things that I want you to tell them. Don't even tell them, though. Like, I'm so frustrated with my people, I don't even want you to speak to them. But we see that God is sending prophet and prophet and prophet and prophet and prophet and prophet into the lives of the people because even though his heart is frustrated, he's mostly frustrated with the fact that they're not listening, not that he doesn't want to speak to them. So this fact, I think, is important. Throw up our next fact. Jeremiah saw the end. Josiah was blessed by God because of his character, and he said, listen, I'm about to eradicate all of my people. I'm going to pull, the 10 tribes are gone, and I'm about to pull the kingdom of Judah out as well. And every promise I made, every army we conquered, every slavery we overcame is all about to be undone, and we're just going to completely hit the reset button. All of you will be eradicated, except Josiah, because of your righteousness, I'm going to delay it past your lifetime. Well, sadly, Jeremiah didn't get that luxury. He was a righteous man, but God left him in place, and he saw the dissolution of the people of God. Jeremiah saw the end. One of the neat things that happens in the book is God has Jeremiah buy property in Israel. And Jeremiah's like, why would I buy property in a dead country? It's a waste of my money. But it was a promise that God spoke, and so on and so forth. Okay, so he sees the end of Israel, and then throw up our last fact. It's been said that Jeremiah is the most personal of the prophets. We've got Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel, Amos and Zephaniah and Haggai and stuff like that. But you've got to understand that most of those, the majority of the content of those books is God speaking to the prophet and then the prophet carrying that message to the people, okay? But there are these interludes. Jeremiah is a strange collection of sermons and then personal angst, and then all of a sudden it's a little bit of the story of it, and then it goes back into sermons again. It's a strange collection, and it's hard sometimes to shift gears. But Jeremiah has large swaths where he's frustrated and feels completely alone. God speaks to him all of the mess that he sees in his culture, and he's got to agree with God. Yeah, I see that. But then God says, hey, because of that, Jeremiah, I'm obliterating everything. And he's in angst over it. He doesn't want it to happen. I mean, you go to the doctor because you want to know what's going on, and then the doctor tells you you've got cancer, and you're like, I don't want to hear that, though. I want to know what's going on, but I don't want to hear that. And so it's really unique. In the book of Jeremiah, there are large portions where he's really pushing back on God, and he's frustrated with him. And some portions of the book of Jeremiah almost sound heretical, and you can't say that. That's not a Bible-y thing to say. Well, it's where Jeremiah was at. But then he looks up and he looks at the people around him, and he can't even commiserate with the people around him because they don't even want to listen to what he has to say. They think he's a wild man and that he's just doomsday and just wants to shock value. And so he's frustrated there and he's frustrated here, and he's known as the weeping prophet. And it's a very personal book. It's unique in the prophets, okay? And so that's where we're at. 600 years before Jesus, Israel is gone, Judah's barely hanging on. Josiah overlaps with his life a bit, but then Josiah dies in this battle with the Egyptians. And Jeremiah is alone. And the 7th chapter we're going to look at today, it's a famous portion of the book of Jeremiah. And God sets him up to deliver a sermon. And it's a watershed sermon. It's, the 95 Thesis on the door of Wittenberg. It's God's speech to his people through the mouth of his prophet Jeremiah. So I'm going to start reading in verse 1 of chapter 7, and along the way we'll stop and explain things. Verse 1. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Stand at the gate of the Lord's house and there proclaim this message. So you picked up on that, right? He's standing on the steps of the temple, Solomon's temple, and I'll bounce back and forth so that it makes sense to us that the steps of the church, the steps of the temple. I understand that the temple wasn't a church, but okay, here we go. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I'll let you live in this place. Don't trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you don't oppress the foreigner, you don't oppress the fatherless or the widow, if you don't shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I'll let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. But look, you're trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. God opens the sermon with this, and it's an acknowledgement that, listen, I designed your freedom so that you and I could be together, and you've not chosen that. The book of Deuteronomy, I believe it's chapter 26, like all of Deuteronomy is, here's how we're going to interact, and here's how you'll remember me, and here's how you'll draw near to me, and here's how you'll recognize each other. Basically, Deuteronomy is, here's how you love me, and here's how you love other people. But towards the end, and I think it's 26, and if I'm wrong, I was wrong in church, that stinks. It says, listen, if you don't do these things that are in the law, here's what's going to happen. That happened hundreds of years earlier, and God can't take it anymore. They hadn't done it. And he says, listen, it could be this way. It's just that I need to speak some things to you. And that's what the prophets are. It's God bouncing back and forth between here's what I see in you, and therefore here's what I'm going to do about it. And here's what I see in you, and here's what I'm going to do about it. Here's what I see in you, and here's what I'm going to do about it. That is a very often repeated, it's what we do in our justice system. You're not sentenced until you're judged. And if you're judged innocent, there's no sentencing. But if you're guilty, then there's a sentence. You do it with your kids. You probably review with them what they did wrong on any scale of, your patience or anger, whatever it is. Typically, we say, what did you do? Why did you X? Therefore, why? Because you did this, this will happen. And it's the pattern we see in the prophets, in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, in Daniel, in Amos. And we see that our own chapter is now going to follow this same pattern, A, B, A, B. And God starts off saying, listen, it didn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. But he's going to speak clearly about what he sees in the life of his people. And so in verse 9, he's going to start speaking what he sees. And he says, will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal and follow other gods you have not known, and then come here and stand before me in this house which bears my name and say, we're safe. Safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? I've been watching, declares the Lord. So keep in mind, the first paragraph, Jeremiah is put on the steps of the church, the temple, and he says, stand there. You're back to the temple. They've trusted in this, and they're out there. And it's this huge picture that your lives out there don't reflect God at all. Your character doesn't reflect Him at all. Your heart, not at all. There's no part of you that even reflects who He is. But you like to live your life and then show up in a temple and say, it's cool, me and God are good. I've got a little club membership that proves I'm fine. And it's like driving past the gym that you're a member of straight to, McDonald's or the 7-Eleven, and then eating your Big Mac and your Slurpee for lunch and saying, it's cool, I'm in shape, I've got a card. God says, don't do that with me. Don't do that if you're going to be the sort of person that you are and then just pull my name into it at the end. If you have a faithless life and then tag me on as a little brownie badge, that doesn't cover up your faithlessness. You're unfaithful, and let's call it that. And so I want you to jot this first thing down. Jeremiah is speaking to a religious people, and when you're religious, you wind up being who you don't want to be. And it seems to me that the biggest evil in our country, and I don't even necessarily know that I disagree, but it seems that the biggest evil in our country is to be a hypocrite. And so right now it's threatening the voice of the gospel in our culture because it forces us, it feels like, to one of two places. Either, okay, I'm going to proclaim Christ in my culture, so therefore I've got to put on a plastic mask and it's all shiny and happy and never reveal my weakness. Or my culture is going to blast me and say, look, I've got weakness, therefore Jesus, and like those two go together. But it seems like sometimes we throw out phrases to cover up our faithlessness rather than to grab a hold of God's faithfulness. So while I agree with the phrase, it's not a religion, it's a relationship, it seems like in our culture, that's coming across like a cop-out. Like, well, I know I should try harder for my, purity. It's not a religion, it's a relationship. I know I should care about the defenseless, but it's not a religion, it's a relationship. And I think that it seems like it's coming across that is our cop-out rather than our claim to God's faithfulness. My gratitude to God's faithfulness absolutely is the superior fact of my following or His faithfulness. I'm choosing that every time. But when it's an excuse that I'm not following at all, well, then all of a sudden we've got dissonance, we've got trouble, we've got difficulty. And God sees in the lives of His people, He's saying, look, you're religious. You love the fact that you've got this big fancy temple and you can come check off a box, you can put your Air One sticker on your car, but I don't affect your heart. That you like to show up at HTC twice a month and say, that's my home church because it's healthy, but your heart is corrupt. That you love, the things of God, but not the person of God. And you wind up being who you don't want to be. The very evil in our culture, that's a hypocrite. I will acknowledge I am not perfect. And I will say that God's love over me is the faithfulness on which my faith is based. However, there is a point where God says, listen, are you following me or not? I'm not saying, are you perfect? I'm saying, are you with me? Or are you obsessed with the things of God that you like to drape over your otherwise empty life and then say, it's cool, I can be heartless, faithless, a complete wreck, but then just check in every so often with some religious thing and have it cover things up. Really what God is after is this. A couple weekends ago, father-son camp out, HTC, yay, camping in tents with our sons in 108 degrees. And so as a good father, you set out and you say, listen, I'm going to have my sons learn responsibility, participate in this. I'm going to go set up the tent. You're going to carry the food because if there's ever going to be something to motivate my sons to action, it's the food, right? So you set off ahead of them. You're setting up camp and they're carrying the cooler with the food behind them. And they realize it's hot and this cooler is heavy and you've got, a good son and a devious son. And the devious son says, what would be better is if we dump the food out. This would be lighter. And your good son, he's a good boy. He's not the brightest bulb. And he says, well, wouldn't that mean we wouldn't have the food? And he's like, listen, Dad said to carry the cooler to the tent site. Like, all we got to do is get this cooler there. I'm not in charge of anything else. And the other sons, he's like, man, you got a good point. Like, I should eat the apple. And so they dump it all out and they pick it up and the good boy's like, you are so right. This is so much easier. And they pick it up and they take it to the site and you're sweating and you're setting it up. You're going to share this time with your sons and they set it down. And when they set it down, it should shake the earth. But when they set it down, it seems to rest on the pine needles. And you're thinking, that does not seem right. And you ask your boys, you're like, did you bring our cooler here? And they're like, yep. The cooler I had in the car. Yep. You brought our cooler here. Yes, Dad, we did. And you walk over and you lift the lid and you're at a church campout. And so you can't say what's in your head. Your volume has to come way down. And you've got to act like you're always cool with your boys. But man, the fires of Hades are welling up in your heart. And so you're trying to navigate this. And you look at them, and your voice gets all high-pitched. And you, am I to eat the flesh of your bones, son? What did you do? Like, oh, Dad, what you asked us to do was so heavy, and so we decided empty was easier. It was just, this was better this way. And you look at them and you think, how could you possibly have thought this is what I meant? And they're like, well, it's what you said. Empty seems easier. It really does. It is so much easier to check off the boxes in a walk with God. I went to church a couple times this month. What else does God want? I read a chapter of the Bible earlier this week. What else does God want? There's no way that He can actually expect my heart to be pulled to His on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. There are times of year or times of life where my heart draws near to God. But honestly, God, the whole all of me thing is crazy. And so I'm going to dump out the heart of what you want for me, and I'm going to have to be okay, and you're going to have to be okay that I'm barely straggling along with an empty cooler. Because that's what I'm able to pull off, God. Because what you've asked of me is too much. And God looks in and He says, don't tell me you're safe because you can tag on a little badge. That's what He sees, and so He goes on and He says what's to come. Verse 12. Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I'm now going to do to this house that bears my name, this temple you're trusting in, the place I gave to you and your ancestors. I'm going to thrust you from my presence, just as I did the fellow Israelites, the people of Ephraim. It's all coming together. Jeremiah is standing on the steps of the church, the temple. They're so proud of it. And it's a testimony of the fact that God has got to be faithful to me, because why else would He have built this big house? Why else would we have a temple if God wasn't going to rescue me from all my mistakes and my faithlessness? God says, I've done it before. Remember Shiloh? It's the first place when the people brought the ark into the land and they established it in Shiloh. Shiloh was the spiritual epicenter. David's the one that wanted to build a temple. It was generations later. And God didn't even tell David he could do it, actually. God said, David, listen, first of all, I'm not stressed about the fact that I live in a tent. I'm immense. A tent, a palace, it doesn't matter. But David said, no, I live in a palace. You live in a tent. I want to build you a temple. God said, well, okay, number two, you're a little too violent. You've too much bloodshed has come through your hand, and so your son will build me a temple. And so it wasn't even until Solomon that Jerusalem had a temple built for the ark. And God says, listen, when the ark was in Shiloh, you guys treated it like a lucky charm. If we just, tap 3 times and quote some Toby Mac, that God will magically make all of this go away, and I don't have to engage with Him on anything. And so there's this important battle. They march the ark out, and the Philistines beat them, and they're like, what happened? We have the ark. And then the Philistines don't want the ark because then God sends His plagues on them, and so the ark bounces from different cities, and God's using this location of the temple and the location of Shiloh to say, listen, when you're obsessed with the things of God and not me, I'll take the things away. And what's interesting is God is very consistent. When you want me, you will always have me. And as a matter of fact, in these moments of promise, across the Old and the New Testament, what's most often coupled with God's faithfulness is our faithlessness. God is always willing to say, if you want me, I don't care if you're blind or you're broke or you're poor or you're broke. I don't care. If you want me, you can have me every time. But when you want the things around me and never me, I'll take those away. I took Shiloh away. And you think I'm caught up with this location, this temple? I don't care. And so the promises that are spoken here will be fulfilled through the hands of the Babylonian people. They're going to keep trying to like deputize the nation by taking kings and taking them over that way. But man, the people are stubborn, so they wind up saying, fine, we're taking all of you to Babylon. All of you are coming, and we're going to clean out your temple. All the nice, cool little artifacts in there, we're going to take them. They'll be ours. And so Jeremiah's standing, it's this weird, like, your lives are hypocritical and you think it's fine because of this, and God's willing to say, this temple I'm standing in front of, I don't even need this temple. I don't need it. I spoke to Moses through a bush. Like, I don't need a building. I don't need the trimmings. And so if you won't follow me, then I'm going to take this away to catch your attention. And he moves on and he says some things about their worship. Verse 16, don't pray for this people nor offer any plea or petition for them. Don't plead with me because I'm not going to listen to you. Don't you see what they're doing in the towns? Their children gather wood, the daddies light the fire, and the mommies knead the dough. And they're making cakes to offer to the Queen of Heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to arouse my anger. But am I the one they're provoking, declares the Lord? Aren't they harming themselves to their own shame? You see, what's happening is God now speaking again. He's in the A pattern, not the B, and he says, here's what I see in my people. Not only are they not loving the people around them, they're certainly not loving me. What they're doing is this. They're worshiping idols in their home as like it's a way to provoke me to jealousy, or like, oh man, they're worshiping Queen of Heaven is Ishtar. It was a Babylonian goddess of fertility. In the whole Mesopotamian area, different people worshiped fertility through different goddesses. That's this Queen of Heaven, okay? And God is saying, okay, you got kids. Let's say your kids have done something dumb for a long time and you've coached them through it and you told them to not do it. Let's say every time they wind up closing the screen door when you're not there with them, they always put their hand like on the frame and they close the door on their hand every time. And you've coached them, you've taught them, you've loved them, you've wept with them, you've boo-booed them. But now your kid is 17 and they're still doing the door, and so they're frustrated with you about something else. And we'll get to that in a minute. And they remember this whole battle over the door. And so what they do is they look at you, and because you're not listening to them about the car or the date or the prom or the college, whatever, they're going to get your attention. And they go back to the screen door. And they put their hand on it, they open it, and they look right at you. And they're like, what now, fool? I'm going to do it. I'm going to close the screen door on my hand. It's a way to entice, to manipulate, to provoke you to act and to move. And you look at them and you think, so help me. If in your 17-year-old mind you think this is a good plan, then your 17-year-old mind is about to get a door slammed on it, because I am not going to get involved in this argument. And so the kid looks at you. And they stare, and in their pain they wonder, why aren't you moving? Why aren't you acting? And you're thinking in your mind, why aren't you walking away from what I told you to stay away from? That's what's happening in the lives of God and His people. You see, at some point, they'd come underneath, I love your brokenness. Oh, I'm drawn to that. But then the next day, we wake up and we're a little embarrassed because we're a little more sinful than maybe we wanted to admit. And so we kind of sidestep a little bit, but man, we still love what God is all about. But then the next day, it's just easier to just... Man, it's hard to keep bringing yourself before a holy God. It's just, and then the next day, and then the next day. And at some point, we wind up worshiping something that's not God because we've walked away. And we like the idea of God, and what God says here is, listen, your worship of other things, it's not going to provoke me to suddenly get in an argument with Ishtar. I won't do it. She doesn't exist. And so if you're wanting to like, oh God, look at me, I'm worshiping Ishtar, aren't you and she going to argue it out to see who gets me? He's like, no, I'm not. Ishtar doesn't exist. You're worshiping your own creation. Why don't you come back here? But they're like a little petulant kid over here saying, no, why don't you come to me? And we do this when we say, man, I love God and I'm going to give my all. It's just that right now, for this season, I really got to focus on my finances. And like we just got to build our portfolio back up. And so, yeah, I know that God calls me to be faithful to Him, but I would really rather spend any Sunday I can grab overtime. I won't lead my family to the Lord. I'm going to work on that. And so in that way, we worship that. Or maybe, it was a season of babies in the house, and so you are tired and you put on some weight, and it's like, I will worship God. It's just right now I've got to focus on me. I've just got to get back in shape. Or maybe it's something a little heavier. And your mom has got cancer. And you really decided that your faithfulness belongs to her and not to God. And then here's what happens. We wind up worshiping our circumstances more than God. What's ironic is God will call you to faithful, financial peace. And He'll call you to, wholeness. He'll call you to love the world around you. But when we start worshiping our circumstances, not God, we like to manipulate Him too, huh? And we say, oh, God, I'll be faithful once you figure out my financial mess. Oh, God, I'll be faithful if you heal my mom. Oh, God, I'll be faithful if, and we're standing with our hand in the door frame, staring back at God and saying, why don't you come over here and fix this, and then maybe I'll be faithful to you. And God says, I'm not going to argue with the door. I'm not going to argue with you about your fear over your finances or your fear over your health. Here's what I'm going to say. Come to me. Worship me. And I'll call you back to what's healthy in all of these circumstances. It's just that we feel more control, we feel more security, we feel more safe when we get to call the shots. And we wind up doing what we don't want to do. We wind up manipulating God. You see, religiosity will achieve this, and you could throw that in the notes. Oh, sorry, that's not the right one. Did we already say it? You can go back. Doing what you don't want to do. We wind up being the crazy backwards teenager that is trying to manipulate my God into moving into the ways I see fit. I have not walked your path of difficulty. I have not. I've had my paths of difficulty, and I've been confused by what God has done through them and in them. And to be honest, there's even a little bit of confusion now that God has reset some of our heartache in losing the daughter, and now He's brought her back. But now, I don't mean to be unfair, but she's messed up from the life she's had for 4 years. And part of us is like, God, why couldn't we have just kept her? Why couldn't she be on track right now as a preschooler rather than, I don't even want to talk about some of the things that seem unfair. But God, why? God's saying, well, why don't you just trust me with it? Why don't you honor me through it? Why don't you be grown in it? And it's like, I'd like to scoot away from that and then bring you over here. God looks at His people and says, listen, a religious person doesn't submit to God. It tries to manipulate God. That's what religion is. And therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, my anger and my wrath will be poured out on this place, on man and beast, on trees of the field and on crops of the land, and it will burn and not be quenched. And so God winds up His speech, this sermon, with these thoughts in verses 21 through 28. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Go ahead, add your burnt offerings to your other sacrifices, eat the meat yourselves. When I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, I spoke to them. I didn't give them the commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I gave them this command. Obey me, and I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. Walk in obedience to all I command you, that it may go well with you. But they didn't listen. They didn't pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubborn inclination of their evil hearts. They went backwards, not forward. From the time your ancestors left Egypt until now, day after day, again and again, I sent you my servants, the prophets, but they didn't listen to me. They didn't pay attention. They were stiff-necked, did more evil than their ancestors. When you tell them all this, they ain't even going to listen to you, Jeremiah. When you call them, they're not going to answer. Therefore say to them, this is the nation that has not obeyed the Lord its God or responded to correction. Truth has perished. It has vanished from their lips. God concludes the sermon with this. He says, roll back the tape the whole way. You think I'm interested in the temple, everybody? You think I'm hung up over the offerings, the festivals, the feasts, the sacrifices? Do you remember when I called you in a relationship with me? Remember when you were in bondage and I set you free? What did I say? I said this, follow me. You didn't even have no 10 Commandments when you came out of Egypt. You had nothing except me. And then as time went on, I gave you commandments. I gave you feasts. I gave you offerings. I gave you festivals. I gave you a tabernacle. I gave you these things so that when you freaked out about me, when you freaked out about manna, when you freaked out about quail, when you freaked out about water, when you freaked out about Egyptians, that you have something to go to, that you'd have something to remember. I gave you those things to help you with me. But you've chosen the things and not me. Pastors do weddings. I do weddings, and I look at the young kids in front of me, and I think, oh, they look nice, but they don't have any idea. You fools are choosing the hardest thing you could possibly choose. And so, like a good pastor, you want to prep them, you want to coach them, you want to prepare them, you know? And so, like, I'm reading my little wedding outline, and it's like, with this ring I thee wed, to having a hold, and I love you so much. That's what you do at a wedding. You know what you should do at a wedding? You should look at the man and say, you know what? You're going to have babies. And then your baby's going to go to kindergarten, and on the first day of kindergarten, you're going to have to ask your boss, hey, can I go with my kid to their kindergarten class to get them settled? And your boss is going to be like, okay. And you're going to go, and you're going to sit in your work clothes, and you're going to sit in a chair that should not even be able to hold a human, but it's going to hold you. And you're going to distribute glue sticks and be excited about the reading bean bag. And then you're going to be thinking the whole time, man, my boss said it was okay, but I hope this doesn't put me in bad standing at work. You're going to be stressed about it. So, husband, I'm going to tell you that right now. Mama, lady, wifey girl, you're going to have babies, and for years, you're going to be stuck at home with people who drool and poo. And you're going to be desperate to talk to adults. You would even talk with men about sports if you could talk with adults. But you know that your baby is an animal when it doesn't nap regularly, and so you're going to be stuck in the house for what's going to seem like 40 years in the desert. And so you've got to weather that storm. You don't tell them that at a wedding. You'd be the worst pastor ever if you did that. You're a horrible person. Here's what you do at a wedding. Do you love her? Do you love him? Okay, then you're married. And all the other stuff that comes with it, you're going to weather through. That's what God says at the end of the sermon. He's like, listen, I said in the very beginning, I called you to freedom, and here's what I said. I wanted it to be clear. So I called you out of bondage into the middle of nowhere. It was a special ceremony, and I said, you and me. That's what I said. But you decided to empty the cooler and decide to walk around with the sacrifices or the offerings or the temple or the festivals or the feasts. And you could live with your heart any old way you wanted to because it was awfully easy to be religious and do things you wanted to do and be the sort of person you wanted to be apart from me. That ain't it. And he says this, truth has perished. It has vanished from their lips. And that's our last fill-in. If we're religious, we'll never change what we want to change. We just won't. That word, truth has perished. It's a Hebrew word, abad. It's used a lot in the Old Testament. And they don't know how to translate it out because it kind of means to, like, it just isn't anymore. Like, oh, honey, you're about to hit that bird. Oh, it isn't anymore. It means annihilate, been lost, broken, corrupt, destroy, destroyed, destroying, destruction, dying, fail, give up is lost, lacking, make vanish, make to perish, no, obliterate, perishes, ruined, take, utterly destroyed, wandering, wastes, wiped out. Man, I set my people up in the Mesopotamian valley in like this fertile crescent, in like the birthplace of nations so that everyone could hear about me. But you guys at some point decided that, man, listening to God is too hard. I'd like to throw the bumper sticker on my car. I'd like to argue on Facebook. I'd like to check off attendance once or twice a month. I'd like to. And God's like, why don't you just me? Why not just here? Why not not even worry about this temple or all of those other things and just me? What about that? But when you don't choose me, then truth perishes. And the world around us doesn't need, and this sounds awful, the world around us doesn't need High Desert Church. They don't need 5 songs and a message. They need God. Their problems go bigger than an hour and 15 minutes can solve. They don't need your morality. They need God. And so what we need to continually choose as a people of God is Him. through these things, and we'll get there next week. And I'm excited to be able to be here next week because I'm not going to solve anything. The prophets are heavy and they're sobering. We don't need to be religious people. Otherwise, we're going to wind up doing what we don't want to do, being who we don't want to be, and we ain't going to change a thing if we're religious. So show up next week and let's talk about what God can change through grace. God, we need our hearts to be filled with grace. And God, I get lazy or I get distracted or I don't even know what it is all the time, God. But it's easy for me to check the things off my list and to go through the motions. And God, sometimes I wind up dumping out the heart of what this is all about and just choosing the shell, the container. And so, God, I pray that you would speak to us as our church. And God, I pray for the High Desert Church of the year 2020. God, may we still exist. God, that we would be effective and that we would be passionate about Christ. And that He would be our salvation. He would be my righteousness. He would be my strength and my hope. God, help us to not substitute you for the things of you. God, help us to not be religious because it sure seems like it's easy to slip into that. And so, God, speak to us next week. Speak to us through our reading, through the groups we're in, through the ministries we're part of. And God, call our church to you. In your name we pray. Amen.